This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is retired academic and lifelong gardener Jo Kirby. Jo's written the Good Slug Guide, the first ever book on slugs and snails that explains why the usual controls often don't work, what slugs and snails really get up to, what they really eat, and importantly, what eats them. Listen on to find out what you can do about slugs and snails in your garden.
I did a little project looking at ground beetles and the effect they had on slugs, just really no more than half a day. Pulled up a lot of information from academia that hadn't made it into the gardening media, and then realized that it was quite interesting, that it was relevant, and I started to collect information from that point on all the natural enemies of slugs and snails. Gradually it built up into this vast data mass, files everywhere, pieces of paper, and then the metaldehyde ban was announced, and I thought, I'd better write it up. So that's what I began to do. And lockdown intervened, COVID, all that sort of thing. But eventually, here it is now.
And a lovely thing it is too. So your book, it's what we've all been waiting for as gardeners. And to kind of give an overview of what the average person, I know there's no such thing as an average garden, but you do mention kind of facts and figures around slug populations in your typical garden. And I wondered if you could maybe just give us a brief overview of what we might be dealing with in terms of numbers and also the variety of species that we might find.
Yes, well, dealing with the variety of species first, because that's what biologists always do. There are 43 species described in Britain. There are possibly 3 more awaiting description. The flora and fauna, I should say, changes all the time with introductions and globalization and so on. About 2/3 of them are found in gardens, but any one garden will only have about 10 or 12 species. And then of those, about 4 will be properly pesty species, and 2 of those will be the grey field slug and the Budapest keel slug, which are probably the 2 most serious pests, although the Spanish slug is coming up on the rails. A lot of people are finding problems with it as it spreads around the country. It was introduced into Britain in 1954, or at least first noticed here, and since then it's been spreading. And it is it's a large species. It eats a lot of stuff. So I would probably add that now to our 2 most serious slugs and make it 3. As for numbers, very difficult to estimate numbers in gardens. A lot of time has been spent trying to work out ways of extracting slugs from soil. None of them are particularly good, so the numbers are quite hazy. The values for the grey field slug in gardens goes up to about 150 per square metre. You can add in the various species on top of that, and you end up with a figure of around 200 a square metre, which is a lot of slugs if you multiply by the area of your garden. So 35,000 species, individuals, I should say, in any one average garden, which is quite a lot.
That is an awful lot. And on top of that, of course, you've got the snails as well to contend with.
Yes, so 99 land snails in Britain. Quite a lot of them have been found in gardens. The only really pesty one we have, though, is the common garden snail. Others will nibble things, but generally they're much more interested in detritus or other things. And really, the common snail, if you provide a habitat for it, it will multiply and you will have lots of those as well.
So I don't know if it's just since I became a gardener and I took it up more seriously, I suppose, perhaps a couple of decades ago. But I think that as a child, I always remember many more snails than slugs. But it seems to me now that slugs are much more prevalent. Is that just me misremembering my childhood in a garden? Or do you think slugs are now starting to out-compete the snails?
Yes, that's a hard one. I mean, slug research is very poorly funded, and slug research in gardens is more or less non-existent. The RHS has done a bit, but a lot of our slugs are less common now than they were back in the war or just after the war, when the first really serious project on slugs in gardens was done. Our shelled slugs, which don't eat plants at all, they eat earthworms and maybe a few other slugs, they seem to be much rarer now. The more common ones are the ones that, as you'd expect, they breed rapidly, they eat a lot of things. And the other problem is that we garden in a way that seems to encourage them now. And that really is what the book is all about. It's changing the way we garden in order to reduce our slug and snail problem. The changes we need really aren't that great, though, so it's easily done. You don't have to panic and think you're going to have to change the way you garden completely.
No, and obviously people need to buy the book to find out how they need to change their gardening. But could you maybe give one or two examples, or is there a sort of broader picture that you can allude to that might mean why we've got more slugs and snails, and how we might need to change our practices in order to reduce the populations, or to make sure that they're not feasting on our favourite plants?
That's a big question. The traditional way is to tidy up, to remove anything the slugs might eat, remove habitat, remove places where they can roost. And yet a lot of that is counterproductive, particularly tidying up. If you remove dead and decaying vegetation, you're actually denying food to slugs and snails, and they will go off and eat your plants instead. So the idea is that you need detritus in the garden in the form of top dressings, mulches, or just letting leaves rot where they fall. And that will deflect your slug's attention away from your plants. There's a very famous chap in slug research called Horace Barnes, who concluded that really in the 1940s. He was ignored, of course, and everybody started to use metaldehyde. But he was firm that slugs ate a wide range of foodstuffs besides green tissues of plants. And if you didn't garden quite as tidily as the books tell you to, you would generally keep your slug problem down to an acceptable level.
A lot of people do avoid things like mulch because they think it harbours slugs and snails or gives them a place to reproduce. So clearly then that's not actually necessarily the case.
Well, they will live and reproduce there, there's no doubt about that, but also you will get a whole stack of natural enemies which live and reproduce there as well. So you, by encouraging organic matter in the garden, you generate a balance between the natural enemies and the slugs and snails. So you regulate your slug population through having natural enemies that live in detritus. The other thing is that you need to have a diversity of plantings, and you also need to have cover. A lot of the natural enemies of slugs and snails don't like bare ground. Some of them aren't keen on dry conditions. They prefer humidity. And they also, of course, avoid being predated if they're under cover. So diverse planting and more detritus in the garden. It's really not rocket science. It does take time, though.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. When people switch over to trying to get more biodiversity in the garden, sometimes there are those peaks and troughs of populations of things. So there's an element of faith involved that it will all pan out in the end. But in terms of plants, has anybody found anything that makes a particular plant particularly tasty to slugs and snails? Or is it more a case of they'll eat what's there when they're hungry, or, they just like certain things and don't like others, and it's arbitrary?
That, again, that's another big subject. Seedlings generally are much more palatable than older plants because they haven't had time to develop tougher leaves, and generally their leaves are chemically simpler. Older plants produce a lot of chemicals that deter grazing, and they will, of course, be more resistant to attack. I don't think, though, you should have a garden that is all slug resistant. It would look quite strange to start with. And also, you need a balance in the garden. So you would probably be changing at some fundamental level the number and types of species of insect that you have in the garden if you did that. So I wouldn't recommend going entirely down the slug-resistant route for plants.
No, and maybe as gardeners, we're obviously out in our gardens, we're inspecting our plants, we care about our plants. And so when we go outside, we might be tuned in to find slugs and snails, because for a lot of gardeners, it's kind of public enemy number one. But it does seem that in your garden, there is definitely more of them than you might find in the wider landscape. Are they attracted to gardens specifically, or is that just because we're noticing them more in gardens?
We're very good at producing an environment in our garden that encourages them. We cut back on the detritus. As a consequence of that, we cut back on the various natural enemies, and really we leave the field open to the slugs and snails. One of the other things that happens is that detritus is actually a very good foodstuff. A lot of species eat it in preference to green tissues. You get what's called a decomposer community, and springtails, woodlice, earthworms, all kinds of things, and they are highly competitive. And in a garden where there is a lot of detritus, you'll develop that community, and they will compete against the slugs for food. So you've got another layer of restriction, if you like, on the activity of the slugs, not just natural enemies, but also those that compete for food with the slugs.
Moving on to I'm afraid it's another big question, but it is one that everybody wants to know about, and that is, do slugs have any value as a foodstuff to other garden inhabitants? And if so, I think maybe they're not the ones that we come to associate with eating slugs and snails, like birds or frogs and toads and hedgehogs.
Slugs and snails are excellent source of protein. They're mostly muscle. If you can eat a slug, you've done well for the day. But generally, the natural enemies are what are called generalists. They don't just eat slugs and snails, they eat other stuff as well. And so if you want them in the garden, you have to really provide a home for the other insects and creatures as well. So you need to develop a community of insects, and it's a case almost of cultivating your wildlife as well as your plants, and that way you increase diversity, you increase abundances, and you will find that the slug problem will gradually decline.
So if we accept the fact that we need to live alongside them, is there an argument to be made for actively encouraging them? Do they do anything apart from compete with the other detritivores in terms of clearing up? Do they provide a useful kind of service?
Oh, some are very good. The green cellar slug is entirely a detritus eater, so it provides what would be called an ecosystem service today, although I wouldn't necessarily choose that phrase myself. There are others as well. We've already looked at the shelled slugs that eat earthworms and maybe a few other slugs. And some of the slugs, the big slug, one or two others, they've been seen to eat the eggs of other slugs. So many of them are useful. I said that there were about 12 species of slug in the typical garden. 4 of them would be pests. That leaves 8, which really are mostly useful. So you do need to, I'm afraid, learn 1 or 2 slugs just to be able to leave them alone. The most obvious one, I suppose, that most people know is the leopard slug, and that really does prefer to eat fungi, detritus, and things like lichens and algae, and leaves green plants alone. The great thing about the leopard slug is it's aggressive to other slugs, including the Spanish slug. Some Norwegian researchers found that where you had the leopard slug, other slugs tended to become quite scarce. So that is very definitely something to encourage in the garden. You just need to learn what it looks like and leave it alone when you find it. The problem is that it is kind of creamy yellow and has dark blotches on it, and it's very close in coloration to the yellow and black that is a warning signal to, well, throughout nature. You need to overcome your reaction on seeing it because it is a big, ugly slug, and leave it and recognise it as a friend.
I like wildlife gardening, but even I was surprised to read that they really are no threat to your plants. Because as you say, they're quite imposing. Yeah, we should definitely leave those alone. Obviously, you mentioned metaldehyde, and we now have slug pellets still on the market. I wondered if you could touch on how effective those slug pellets are, and actually, is it okay to use them in a wildlife garden? Are they perfectly safe for things like hedgehogs?
Yes, I've been asking ever since I started this project. I've been asking people about how they're getting on with the new ferric phosphate pellets, and some say they're fine, others say they're rather mixed. So I'm not quite sure that enough information is in. I mean, there's no quantitative data being collected on this sort of thing anyway. Really, it's just a matter of collecting people's views, anecdotal evidence, as they call it. The main slug that the ferric phosphate pellets was developed for was the grey field slug, which is by far the biggest pest in agriculture. And that's where the biggest market is. Of course, gardeners have to deal with more species, and I rather suspect that the research that was done concentrated on the effect on the grey field slug and rather ignored the effect on species that you typically find in gardens. So you've got a question mark there. You know, are the slug pellets genuinely effective against some of the garden species? And certainly the Spanish slug seems to be quite resistant. It can eat quite a lot of ferric phosphate before it stops eating, for example. So you may accidentally encourage Spanish slugs in the garden if you add slug pellets, because you're removing the other slugs that act as a competitor against the Spanish slug. It's a question that has to be asked, and there are no answers on that one at the moment. Generally, though, ferric phosphate obviously contains phosphate. People are worried about phosphate enrichment. Most of the manufacturers have a note on the package about not treating your ground more than 4 times in any 1 year, and I'm fairly sure that that is because of fears over phosphate enrichment. So yeah, that problem. Also, the iron in the pellets isn't very soluble, so what's called a chelating agent has to be added to make it more soluble, and that in itself is an artificial product. It's not at all toxic to humans. It's actually used in the food industry in many products, but it does increase the solubility of things like heavy metals as well. So that has led to worries about the water quality of our lakes and rivers as well. The news is that another type of iron molluscicide is being developed. I believe the applications that are in at the moment for permits is based on elemental iron, so that would immediately remove the phosphate problem, and also apparently the chelating agent problem as well. But that obviously is some way away now. That will have to go through the regulatory process.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about the agricultural applications of it as well, because as gardeners, we probably don't consider that, but they are obviously a problem, especially where you've got a monocrop or, like you said, a lack of other regulating environment. I'm thinking about slug controls that have been used historically. In the book, you touch on a lot of them. And I wondered if maybe you could pick perhaps your favourite natural, or, well, it actually doesn't need to be natural, it can be any sort of slug control that we've used historically that really hasn't had any effect, but yet we've persistently, as gardeners, continued to use it and hope vainly that it has a beneficial effect.
Well, 30 years ago, I was a metaldehyde man, and I just began to get so disheartened. I was forever adding pellets. It seemed to be unremitting. There never seemed to be any solution, any permanent cure. So I started to look at other ways, and this way of adding detritus and increasing cover really came about gradually. We practice it here in the garden, and it does keep slugs down to an acceptable level. We have a lot of creatures in the garden. We have many ground beetles. We don't have any slow worms, unfortunately. I think we're too high and too cold here. We get hedgehogs and so on, and it's a case of having a balance. Hedgehogs, unfortunately, eat a lot of ground beetles, but by providing nooks and crannies, places where your helpers can live, homes for helpers, you can mitigate the effect of what is called intra-guild predation in ecology, and it's where the members of a community that does the similar sort of job, so we would say that slug eaters form a guild. And fortunately, you get predation within. The big ones eat the small ones, so you have to mitigate that. And you do that by increasing cover and adding leaf litter.
It's always the way, isn't it? We just need to strike that balance. And there's a lot of talk about having a complexity of habitats within your garden. Do you think, again, that would be useful?
You can adopt that approach, and your garden becomes incredibly busy and not particularly relaxing. But one of the things about having a range of habitats in the garden is that you get boundaries between them. And those are places where you get spikes in diversity. You get species from the one habitat, you get species from the other habitat, and then you get some species which are adapted to live at junctions between habitats. So you get this spike of diversity. So yes, having a range of habitats in the garden is a good thing, but you don't really want to go over the top because you will find it gets too busy for your eyes. It's not a relaxing garden. You need to strike, as ever, a balance there. We have wide areas of grass, which we keep separate from the mown lawn, and we use actually spent pea sticks to put a lattice work around. And we find that we have a lot of mining bees, solitary mining bees that nest in the short grass. We have another range of species that nest in the long grass, and we get, of course, the advantage of all the wildflowers as well. So you can have, these different habitats quite easily in the garden. It's really just a case of different management, and it works.
One of the things you mentioned, actually, which I thought was very interesting because it kind of flies in the face, actually, of what came out of a recent symposium that I attended, and that is disturbance. Disturbance is kind of championed at the moment as a good thing. I guess it's a question of regeneration and, all sorts of other reasons, but I think that you're actually advocating for minimising disturbance if you want to keep your slug population down. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, definitely. If you think about natural environments where disturbance is minimal, I mean, there is always disturbance because things come along and dig and what have you. But where disturbance is minimal, slug numbers do tend to be very low, particularly in things like woodland where there's a lot of litter there. So you need really to think about other habitats and how many slugs and snails there are in those. The difference between woodland and a garden is something like 100-fold. It's not a small difference. These are big numbers. And then in grassland, you get more slugs, but generally they're fewer. Agricultural land has numbers that are very similar to in gardens. And again, that's a highly disturbed place with relatively low diversity. So although the research hasn't been done, and I doubt if it will be, the indications are that you try to avoid disturbance as much as you can. I'm not saying, don't do anything. You can dig your beds, but it's a case of having areas that remain undisturbed for lengths of time where a diverse community can develop.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's good to know. And I've got one last question, and it's on behalf of the people of Hastings. And I know from experience that the town seems to be besieged by slugs, and they will eat plants in Hastings that they would not touch anywhere else. Are coastal towns notorious for being high in slug and snail populations, or is it just a case of Hastings being cursed with them?
I don't know of any information that says that you get more slugs and snails in coastal gardens at all. I would suggest it's more to do with the way people garden. Possibly people tend their gardens more, keep them neater, tidier, and they affect their populations of natural enemies. I wouldn't like to say any more than that without going and looking for myself.
Well, if you ever fancy a new research project, I'll find you something in Hastings.
Thank you very much to Jo. I hope this gives you the information you need to find room in your hearts and in your gardens for slugs and snails. And thank you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 91, The Living Jigsaw with Foulborn, and episode 160, Making a Wildlife Garden with Chris Baines. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.